Okay, welcome back. Please take your seats, remaining people. Silence. Perfect. Okay, we're going to slightly shift focus. I don't know how, as one of the organisers, I gave myself the after lunch slot, followed by the last speaker at the meeting. The two potentially worse slots, but let's see how this goes. Right, so we're going to shift focus. We're going to pick up on some of the key issues in the earlier sessions, but we're really going to focus on research ethics governance. And we're thinking about that in its broadest sense. So we're going beyond research ethics overview, although that's a key component. And we're going to focus on a few questions that have already come up. One is, how ought we to govern research into climate change and health going forward? So how's it being governed now? Is it fit for purpose? Particularly all the issues that were raised pertinent to the issues raised this morning. Are the current modalities we have fit for purpose? Are the people who have responsibility aware of their responsibilities? What are the philosophical underpinnings of the way that we're governing research in this space? And I think the plenary scenes and the case studies really set the scene for this discussion really well. We had the focus on the practical, on the ground of what was happening from Fortunate's talk, on the realities and the key issues that are coming up, followed by Julian's talk, who really framed that about some of the philosophical, ethical changes and challenges we need to address in this space. And I would argue governance is a key component of that. If we don't govern the research well and ethically, a lot of these will be moot points. As Fortunate mentioned, I was privileged to be the chair of the ethics track at the SHAC meeting, so the Climate Health Africa Conference, the first of its type. Amazing, really, over 400 participants, a real credit to Fortunate and their colleagues for the organisation of that. Many key themes came up, and a real coalescence, I think, of mixed communities coming together. And a couple of things really stood out that I think are pertinent for these questions around research ethics governance. And they've already come up today, this real focus on transdisciplinarity. Like, everyone was focusing on the need not to be siloed. You know, if we're going to be successful in the research we do, we have to be transdisciplined. And that's all the way through from this co-creation model that we've been hearing about, all the way through to inviting all these different disciplines into the room, all the way through to how we translate that into policy. It's health, it's environment, it's planetary health. And that's a really big challenge. And I think that has come across as a key theme across the talks. And at WHO, we have a program of work looking at this, and we put out a call, and I think some people in the room responded to that call, looking at small projects on the ethics of climate change and health research. We had over 170 responses to that. Really interestingly focused around a nexus of issues: vulnerability, inclusion, exclusion, marginalisation. How do we include different knowledge systems? All have come up to date. Research agenda setting. And that's critically related to research governance as well. But the transdisciplinarity issue is a real culture shift. And if you just take one facet of that, I mean, there's so many facets. Take data or knowledge translation. Data is not neutral, despite the way that we often portray it as an evidence base that is neutral. And there are data hierarchies out there. And there are data hierarchies within the climate change and health space. I bet you half the social sciences don't always understand the epidemiological data and vice versa. So there's a hierarchy, there's a lack of understanding. There are also different incentives for why you would share data. Very different incentives, and that's really important when we're doing research. There are also curation issues, the way that we collect the data, the methodological approach. What I'm saying is they don't necessarily speak to themselves, and they're not value neutral. And I think that's where ethics comes in as part of the challenge, is how do we out the values so that we don't have some of the pre-existing bias? How do we collect the evidence in the face of uncertainty? What evidence and data is not being included when we marry all these different disciplines? These are really important challenges that we need empirical research, but we also need to think, how do we govern this? How do we govern this complexity of data? And that's just one of the complexities within transdisciplinarity that I think as an ethics community we have an obligation to think about how we govern the research we do. I think there are really interesting issues that came up in that meeting about the perceptions on the use, misuse of data, extraction of data, where the data sits, ownership. These are not necessarily unique to this field. They are exacerbated in this field by the complexity of the players involved. So I think we really do need to work together, and governance will be a key component of how we articulate also the roles and responsibilities of the different players, and we're going to talk a bit more about that in this session. Also, when you marry all these disciplines, you also, marry is maybe not the right word because we might end up with a divorce, so I don't know, is it integrate? But then we've got problems with integration. So when you bring them all together, you've got to look at the different approaches. Environmental ethics has a very different approach to risk-benefit analysis than we do in research ethics, traditional research ethics. Other disciplines may have much more of a focus on the community than we have traditionally had in research ethics. So there has to be these huge shifts, and we can't take them for granted. We have to think how we govern them. And I think focusing on this end-to-end model of co-creation will mean, how do we govern that? How do we really bring in communities from the very beginning? And there was a great question, I thought, in the morning session about how do you actually, is the community involved in the interpretation of the data at the end? Are they involved in the outputs? Are they involved in the implementation? So I think really interesting questions that we need to address, and governance is key to that. And I think if you turn this issue around, turn the lens around, what are our responsibilities as a global health research community, right? COVID emphasized the amount, there was a lot of research waste, right? The environmental impact, let alone the ethical justification for that, but the environmental impact of that research waste is itself something that we need to think about and work out how to govern. And that's tied into ethics of priority setting as well. So thinking about how we reduce research that is not needed in this space is also really important. And I would argue that fits under issues around research ethics governance. So our duties to mitigate and adapt as a research community need to be thought through in this context as well. Finally, I've just highlighted a couple of the areas that we could speak about. We've got 3 exceptional speakers who are going to pick up on 3 distinct elements, and then we're going to break out and first have a bit of plenary discussion for points of clarification to start the discussion, and then pick up on these themes in our breakout groups. First, we have Tony, who's going to speak to us about the philosophical and conceptual issues that are challenging our approaches to governance and the way we do research. Anna Palmero is going to talk about a real case study. Anna is part of the WHO's Headquarters Ethics Review Committee Secretariat, so she's on the coal face of receiving these types of applications. So we're really, again, going to sort of anchor this in a practical example. And finally, we've got Carleigh Krubiner, who's the bioethics lead at Wellcome, who is tasked with thinking about reflecting on the responsibilities in this system. You know, who has responsibility to do what, when, how? How do we govern? And I'm going to leave you with thinking that I think as a community, we have to really take responsibility. And that should be some of the work that we do when we leave this meeting. And with that, I'm going to invite Tony Capon, who is the director of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute and holds a chair in planetary health. And a warm welcome to you, Tony.
Well, thanks very much, Catherine, and terrific to be with you all here. This is my first time I've been at this forum, and I'm really enjoying the interactions. I've worked in this broad area of climate change and health and planetary health for more than 20 years. So my remarks will really come from that perspective. Certainly, as Catherine said, Fortunate and Julian opened up and began to surface a number of issues that were picked up on in the subsequent session. My remarks begin with a question. Where is the biosphere in contemporary bioethics? The term biosphere means the living parts of the Earth system. So where is that in our field of bioethics? Frankly, the answer to the question, as far as I can see, is that the biosphere is not on the radar in most contemporary bioethics research and practice. Of course, to be fair, the biosphere is not on the radar in most health policy and in the day-to-day work of most health professionals. That's because health professionals are really busy focusing on the needs of the patients in front of them. That means that in many ways the dilemma of getting action on health and climate change is similar to the long-standing challenge of getting health systems to focus on prevention of health problems rather than just treating them once they happen. There's no doubt that attention to climate and health is new for most health organisations and health professionals. In a forum like this, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that and that we're kind to ourselves, because many of us won't have paid attention to climate change. WHO has been arguing for more attention to climate change health impacts for about 30 years. In fact, since the first UN climate change conference. It took until last year in Dubai at COP28 for there to be a health day at that series of conferences. It took 28 years. It took 28 years for there to be a meeting of health ministers at the climate change conference, for there to be a health declaration. And with COP29 underway now, at the moment in Baku, it is good that climate change will be the first named strategic priority in the new WHO General Programme of Work, GPW 14, that begins next year. So it is coming up the priority. It will be the first named from next year. And so we need to engage as best we can. A broader historical lens is also really useful in this discussion. For example, it's notable that Hippocrates in ancient Greece, more than 2,000 years ago, wrote a book entitled On Airs, Waters and Places. And of course, as you know, Hippocrates is now considered the father of Western medicine as it's currently practiced. And the Hippocratic Oath is an ethical framework for medicine. So more than 2,000 years ago, Hippocrates was talking to his patients, thinking about how they lived and where they lived, and reflecting on what those living conditions meant for their health and well-being. But it wasn't just Hippocrates. Fortunate referred to Ubuntu philosophy from Africa earlier today. Chinese ways of knowing about health and well-being for centuries, the Tao, the Way. Traditional Indian ways of knowing about health and well-being, Ayurveda. Indigenous ways of knowing from around the world, more than 60,000 years in Australia. All these philosophies begin with an understanding that people are part of nature. the biomedical model, which is the current dominant model for understanding health and health research, is a very new model, less than 100 years. And it's not founded in these understandings. So we need to shift the dominant biomedical model in all our health systems around the world. And frankly, that will be particularly difficult for the Anglophone world, for high-income countries like mine, for the United States, for the United Kingdom. They dominate the way we think about health and well-being. We need ultimately to bring an eco-social understanding to health, acknowledging ecological, economic and social foundations of health. And that's what the idea of planetary health is. That's what the Lancet was striving for with that commission 10 years ago now. If we come to some of the more specific philosophical and conceptual issues, interventions to address health impacts of climate change may indeed exacerbate health inequities. And I'll use a classic example of air conditioning in a city like KL and Delhi. Here today, we're in an air-conditioned room, and there's no doubt that people who live in cities like KL and have access to air conditioning are protected from the health effects of extreme heat. However, in doing so, in using air conditioning, they're making it hotter. We are making it hotter for people who don't have air conditioning here in KL today, because the hot air that would have been inside this room is now outside the room. And this has exacerbated the urban heat island for people who don't have air conditioning here in KL today, for people who don't have air conditioning in slums in Delhi and elsewhere. And on top of that, use of air conditioning in many parts of the world is exacerbating climate change, because in many parts of the world, the air conditioning is powered by fossil fuel energy. And so it's actually making climate change worse. In systems thinking, we call this a fix that fails. And it's critical that we think more deeply about the kinds of interventions that we're researching and their prospects for actually sustainably improving health and well-being. Healthcare is currently part of the problem of climate change. In 2020, we published the first global assessment of the environmental footprint of healthcare, work led from the University of Sydney with the Potsdam Institute in Germany and Monash University, where I'm based. We found that healthcare systems are responsible for more than 4% of all carbon emissions, much of this in the supply chains for pharmaceuticals and medical devices. Healthcare is also responsible for more than 4% of particulate pollution, nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxide. All of these things harm health in different ways. So the key ethical message is that as we care for health, we're harming health. And the nub of the issue is that these are not the same people. We're providing care for our patients, sometimes in high-income countries, but the people who are being harmed in those supply chains are often in very different countries, often in low-income countries. So where the medical devices are made, where the plastic gowns are made, where the pharmaceuticals are made increasingly. So it's an ethical challenge for us that if we only focus on the patient in front of us, we are not understanding the broader implications of the care we're providing. And Julian referred to this this morning when he talked about the nub of many of these ethical issues coming to light. So the new methods we've got to look at these material flows around the world and new environmental methods can be helpful in bringing this to the attention of health researchers. Health research itself is also currently part of the problem, and a plug for the session tomorrow morning at 8:30 when we'll all perhaps be a little bit dusty from what happens tonight, but there'll be more focus on this tomorrow. At the heart of the problem is anthropocentrism, the focus on the human. Our singular focus on people in healthcare is having unintended consequences, and we need to think beyond the human. Of course, this is very challenging for many health professionals because our raison d'etre is the well-being of people. But what has changed now in the Anthropocene is that we can't be acting in the best interests of our patients if we don't consider the environment. The changes are so urgent and at such scale. The dominant scientific and research paradigm is also a problem. We need to think more ecologically in the work we do. Absolutely continue to use epidemiology as a way of understanding patterns of health, but complement it with ecological understanding. And the Canadian Public Health Association published an important report on this back in 2015. Indeed, the way we think about epidemiology and the whole idea of an ecological fallacy in epidemiological research makes us not want to engage with ecology. But the whole definition of ecology, it's about home, it's about us, it's about our places. And we absolutely must be more holistic in the research we do. I won't recap on all of the really important issues that have already been raised, but perhaps just to finish with reference to the well-being of future generations and its importance in bioethics, and to note that for some bioethicists, it's not seen as a valid concern to care for the well-being of future generations, to bring them into our thinking, because they don't exist yet. And we should just focus on people who are currently alive in the world. It's no longer possible for us to do that if we're practicing ethically in a health context. And some countries are engaging with this. You may be familiar with the idea of a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales, which was announced at the same time as the SDGs. So a lot more to do in that space, and I'm sure we'll discuss it further. But let me finish with a question. I began with a question, let me finish with one as well. Can we imagine a new bioethics that is for both people and the planet? Thank you.
Fantastic. Tracy, of many of the challenges ahead of us. I'm going to invite Anna up next to walk us through a very practical case study. It's fine.
I need a presentation. Okay, we can see we can put it afterwards. Okay. Okay, I hope you are not, are you awake? Well, okay, we're going to, this is going to be a practical discussion. So I would like to invite you to reflect on the practical implications of a narrow concept of research ethics in this field, but particularly in the research ethics oversight process. So, as you all know, REC's mandate is to protect human participants in research and to ensure the social value of a study in terms of the significance of the knowledge to be produced to promote and to improve human health. So recs are entirely focused on human interest. So to understand the practical implications of this, I would like to share with you an example of a study adapted from a real study implementing a One Health approach to control a vector-borne disease. In this case is schistosomiasis. As many or some of you may know, schistosomiasis is a vector-borne disease that is transmitted by freshwater snails that affects humans and also animals. And climate change had affected the population of these snails by increasing the population because of the changes in temperatures and other climate events such as floods and droughts. So as we heard from Julian today in the morning, One Health approach implies a holistic and integrated approach that recognizes that human health is linked to the health of animal, plants, and our environment. So now, yes, we can have the slides. This is just for you to follow me, so it's easier. So what is the aim of this study? The study wants to develop a One Health strategy for the control of snails populations to disrupt the transmission cycle of schistosomiasis, considering the impact of climate change on the population of snails, and to develop an effective strategy, surveillance of snails and infection rates in humans and animals to understand the prevalence of the disease, and the dynamic of the snails population in the context of climate change. These are the study activities. And with this evidence, the ultimate goal is to co-develop a One Health strategy with experts, stakeholders, and members of the community affected by this specific disease. Next slide. So to achieve these different objectives, this study has, no, the previous one. To achieve these different objectives, the study have different components. And first, to determine the prevalence of the disease, we have a human component, that's a surveillance of children and adults that had symptoms of the disease. An animal component, that is a surveillance of livestock, animal farms, and also domestic animals like dogs. And to determine the association between snail vector and climate change, the surveillance of snails, this is to identify the snails in the natural water bodies surround the population affected by the disease, and the collection of environmental and climate data to determine the changes in meteorological data and events in time. And with all this evidence, to co-develop an evidence-based One Health approach, there are different stakeholders and community engagement activities. This is to raise awareness about the disease and the way to control it, and also to co-create the strategy. And among all these activities, we also have study activities that could be interviews or focus group discussions. So as you can see, all these activities require a transdisciplinary research team, including public health, animal health, social scientists, and also environmental practitioners. So you need to have a transdisciplinary team. So keeping in mind this study, I can go to the next slide. What are the practical implications of our current ethics review process? What happens if this research team submit the protocol to a research ethics committee? As we said, research ethics committees are focused on human interest. So should recs only review the human component of this study and the activities in which humans are involved? According to their current mandate, this is indeed what they should do. But if they do that, what happens with the ethics or the ethical issues that could be raised by the components that involve animals? and what happens with environmental risk. For example, who is responsible for reviewing the strategy to reduce the snake population? Who is responsible to reviewing that it is environmentally and ethically sound? And also, what about future generations' interests? Who is responsible for reviewing the oversight of this? And in terms of practical implications for research teams, do we expect them to submit one protocol to different ethics committees or entities, making the process even more complex and more bureaucratic for them? Next slide. And is it reasonable that a study implementing a One Health approach, as we heard, is a holistic and integrated approach, is being separated in components and being reviewed by different entities instead of being reviewed with a holistic approach? And is this conception of research ethic oversight adequate for this type of research? And I think it's not. We should have a different ethic review process, a more comprehensive ethic review process. But if we adopt this holistic approach, how can this be achieved? Should REC's mandate be expanded to protect non-human interests? And in practical terms, should we keep expanding REC's mandate, even if we know that still today many RECs still lacks resources and expertise to do an effective review? And so can we envision a different ethics review process, more dynamic and collaborative, transdisciplinary process involving all implicated stakeholders, including affected community members? So as you see, I only have questions, and I would like to hear your thoughts about what you think an ethics review and oversight process would look like to match with the complexity of this kind of research. So thank you, and then I would like to hear you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Anna. We seem to be throwing up more questions than answers. Not unexpected, but we've gone from the meta level to the very practical, real-world, on-the-ground questions, and I now want to hand the floor to Carleigh Krubiner.
Great, thank you. So by this point in the program, it should be really clear that this is a really big and complex task to take on. The range of climate considerations in how we operate as a field of bioethics and how we operate as a community of health researchers. Also acknowledging that there are some big challenges even in the space of climate and health research, particularly when we consider the extreme conditions in the context in which this research is taking place, as we heard this morning: drought, floods, disruption of food systems, water. As Anna pointed out, these are really big questions, and is this in scope for an REC? I would say it would be far too much for any research ethics community to try and take on alone. And much like the needed broader approaches to addressing climate change, this requires a broad commitment of actors across the research ecosystem. So how do we think about what's needed both upstream with regard to researchers who are involved in designing these studies, as well as funders, and downstream with regard to the obligations once we've done this research to translate that into policy and action? In the first instance, I think there are obligations that we as a research community hold in terms of how we conceive what are the priority research questions, how are we approaching the design and approaches, how are we seeking funding support, and when this is done with deep knowledge of the study setting, the context, the research issues, and the priorities of communities who are most affected, either led by or co-developed with members of affected communities, I think that there's a real opportunity to shape the research in ways that will be much more impactful and much more respectful. And we've heard already this morning from some of these approaches that Anvu and Meyer have taken in their approaches to doing this. Again, I think there are really big questions that remain unresolved, particularly around ancillary care. So when we are going to these spaces, we know that the need in the background is going to be much broader than any research question or topic can take on. What are the obligations both of the researchers going into those spaces and the funders who are funding that research to deliver on the much wider background needs of the affected communities? And I actually don't think that we have good answers yet. I think we know that there's a need. I think we know we're falling short, but we don't yet have the right ways of figuring out how to address that dire need. Further, as has come up in many of the presentations earlier today, it is absolutely critical to center the needs of people who are actually affected by climate change and its health impacts when developing adaptation strategies that will actually be beneficial and acceptable to communities that need them the most. And this is why Welcome has a broad commitment in all the research we fund to supporting engaged research approaches and really trying to make sure that the research that we're funding is reflecting and respecting the needs of the people who are actually facing these health conditions or health impacts of climate change. But the role of funders does not stop there. There are a number of things that Welcome recognizes its role and obligations alongside other funders to support ethical research both in the climate health space as well as thinking about the climate impacts of the wider range of research that we fund. So within the climate health space, we have obligations to think about how we shape the specific research funding calls that we're putting out for climate health, what we focus on, what's in scope for funding, including what types of evidence and knowledge are eligible for funding applications, and also how we communicate what we expect from our study teams and applications to address ethics as part and parcel of the work that they're doing. This also includes a broader portfolio approach to make sure that we're not neglecting some of the other health impacts related to not just climate change, but climate-sensitive infectious diseases and the mental health impacts of how climate change is affecting populations. Within that, there are also obligations amongst our committee members of how they're evaluating applications, again, to make sure that these are done in respectful ways and responsive ways, to, again, make sure that there's appropriate centering of indigenous, local, traditional sources of knowledge. And then beyond those things, we also are doing quite a bit to look at the sustainability of the research that we fund across the board. Recognizing that our own carbon footprint, as Tony mentioned, the research enterprise is not without its own climate impacts, that there are ways that we can mitigate on that front and also move toward more sustainable and greener research practices. So some of the actions that we've taken so far in this effort, we are a signatory to a Concordat for environmental sustainability of research, as well as the Heidelberg Agreement with public commitments to take action. We have currently a policy for environmentally sustainable research that applies to funded researchers and institutions. You'll note that earlier we mentioned the offsetting for this particular meeting. That's just one example of how that is playing out in some of our funded grants. We also are investing in the development of digital tools that can support researchers to actually estimate and minimize the environmental impact of their work. So whether it's greening their labs or figuring out different ways that will make their research less impactful and more sustainable. Because it's really hard to put all of that on research teams to try and figure out, okay, well, what are the climate impacts of my research and how do I address this? So we're trying to invest in tools that can be used by people to do this more efficiently and to just make it easier and the default option. We also have big ambitions to support collaborations and share responsibility within the research system. That's part of the reason that we are signatories to these concordats, trying to share knowledge and best practices across funders, across other major research institutions, so that we can continuously move the dial toward more sustainable research. I should also note we have a whole climate policy team that is involved at the higher level. There are many of them at COP this week, trying to figure out how they can influence on the mitigation strategy. So this is very much a commitment that we see as funders, a huge role for us to play, particularly given that we have centered climate and health as one of our core pieces of our mission. But again, this is an ongoing journey. We're not doing it perfectly. I don't think anybody is. And we are very much eager to learn from all of you about how we can continue to advance and promote integration of climate considerations in all of the research we fund, and also to do our specific climate and health research better. So I think it's a really wonderful opportunity to think about the ways in which all of this community, including funders, including researchers, RACs, policymakers, many of the people that are represented in this room, how we can collectively come together to figure out how we can move the dial and just do this better. It's an urgent crisis, and I'm glad that you're all here to help us think through this. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Carleigh. I think it's really helpful to hear from the perspective of a research funder in terms of responsibility, but I would say it is a collective responsibility. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. What I'd like to do is take 2 or 3 at once. We've turned the heating down, so we're freezing you to keep you awake. So I'm going to take 2 or 3 and then give my panelists a chance to respond, and then you can also pick up all these issues during your breakout group discussion. So over to, please do say your name when you ask a question so everyone in the room knows who you are. Right, I'm going to say Ramina's name, but she can still say her own name.
Thanks. I have a lot of questions. Okay. It's one question that contains many topics. No, it's for Anna. Thank you for your presentation, and it's also an ask for help, because I would like to share the challenges that we faced trying to submit a protocol for a transdisciplinary project that interconnect climate change and health. And first, we offer to participants to anonymize their information, but this is a transdisciplinary project, so they are co-authors of the results of the project. So how can we deal with this? And then we have this. In the process of doing this, we call the non-academic participants, and we call ourselves researchers. So all the framework and all the narrative that we have for doing this, for writing and submitting the protocol, is not really compatible with this transdisciplinarity. So yeah, I would like to ask you how to do about this.
Hold that. Okay. It's impossible to get a room of philosophers to ask a short question. I'll remind myself of this.
All right. I think my question's for Carleigh. I know one big issue in the climate ethics literature about responsibility is whether historical emissions are relevant and whether they generate responsibilities to bear the cost of mitigating or adapting to climate change. Do you think like polluter pays principle, ability to pay principle, do any of these different ways of thinking about the relevance of historical emissions play a role in sort of funders' understanding of what they owe the world, and whether historical emissions are relevant here?
Aren't you happy I'm buying you time to think about that? And if you're fair, Caesar, it'll be for Tony.
Yes, it's for Tony, unfortunately. And sorry if this question is going to be a little bit provocative, but I'm just sharing a doubt that I also have, and a risk that I think we all perhaps run, which is, we are now beginning to say, yes, we need to think more holistically. So we begin to draw from knowledges of other peoples that we have not considered up until now. So we start talking about Ubuntu, or learning from Eastern or Asian conceptualizations to be more holistic. The problem is this. Is this just another way of actually extracting knowledges from different sources without seriously interrogating ourselves? To what extent are we willing to go to say that perhaps our model is wrong, and therefore we need to engage in a process of unlearning in order to embrace different ways of learning and different ways of knowing, being, and acting? And what will this imply? Because the white elephant in the room, really, I think that with all that we've been talking about, is that basically we've made health a commercial product. And are we willing to retreat from that model? Or are we just trying to adjust a model that is ill-suited?
Right, I'm going to be fair to our panelists. Some short reflections on some very trivial questions, starting with Anna, Carleigh, and Doni, and then I'll take 3 more questions, then we're going to go out into breakout groups. God, it's tough.
Okay.
Anna, go ahead.
Okay, I try to answer your question. I think that actually I would need more information, but the problem is with the actual ethics review system, that what I was trying to say is that it's focused on human interests. So the first place, what you're saying is actually a problem with humans. So in that case, what you would need to identify is the role that these persons are having in the protocol. When they are research participants, you should apply all the ethical standards for them, and in that case, privacy and confidentiality of their data is important. It has to be ensured in the protocol. And in the case of co-creation, what you need to see, when we talk about co-creation is not a study activity, actually. It's a different kind of activity. It requires a dialogue, and actually it requires co-creation. So it's not a study activity. I've seen many times in protocols that community engagement activities are confused with interviews or focus group discussions, and those are data collection methods. They are not actually engagement activities. Engagement activities requires some other type of discussion and involvement between researchers and people and the community or whoever participates of this process. So it depends on the role, but I think that is important for researchers to understand if those persons are being participants of a research, or if they are really being partners and collaborators, and they are really being part of that co-creation. No? I hope I answer.
Go, Carleigh.
Great. I'll take the very unpoliticized question of historical emissions and corresponding duties. Look, I mean, if I'm putting on a philosopher hat, I think that there are conceptions of restorative and remedial justice that would very much lean into a stronger duty to address climate action and or investment in reducing emissions or greening the health research space, or any number of actions that are required to actually tackle this urgent question, and then how that's distributed across different nation states that have been historical polluters versus private actors that have been historical polluters. Again, these are really big and contentious questions. From Wellcome's perspective, I mean, we sort of see our role as a private charitable foundation as, wow, there's this really urgent health challenge, probably one of the most urgent of our times. We are in a position to be able to do something about it. Therefore, it is an almost duty of rescue. We will do it, and we are trying to put our money where our mouth is. So, I won't speak on Wellcome's behalf around some of those broader questions, but I think we see for ourselves a real opportunity and corresponding obligation, because we can, we should, to intervene where we can, both, again, in some of those high-level policy conversations, but also in the funding of research that can identify both what's going on in terms of health impacts of climate change as well as adaptation strategies. So I don't know if that addresses your question, but that's the best I can do.
Well, yeah, thank you very much for that question. It's provocative, and it's a really important question. And in fact, we began discussing this in our small group session before lunch. I think it's a fundamental challenge that we need to grapple with, that the dominant medical system that we have in the world now is not delivering what we need. If a country like the United States can be spending 18% or more of its GDP on providing healthcare to people who are sick, we've got a problem. And so absolutely we need to rethink, and I really like your language of unlearn, because at the heart of the problem is the dominant health and medical culture in the world. And that's why it's really helpful if we don't just tinker at the edges and look for new technological solutions. The magic bullet in this area. We actually have to start from scratch almost in terms of the way we understand health and well-being. And you know, the WHO definition is not just about technological healthcare. It's actually a broader definition, and we need to challenge ourselves to, as we look ahead, to find a different path, because I would say we're off track, absolutely.
Okay, we're running out of time. What I'm going to do is let 3 people have say their question and let our lovely panellists off the hook by not responding, because we're running out of time. But it'll be good to get the questions out there, and you can take those into the discussion group. And because I'm standing next to this gentleman.
Hi, I'm Jay from India. So this is a question on the funders' perspective. We heard in the morning that there is wide disparity between who gets funded and what gets funded, and that has an ethical dimension to it as well. So as a funder, not just at the international level, but also within countries, how do you decide what gets funded, and how do you bring the ethics dimension into it? Thank you.
Ethical research priority setting. Last year's GFBR.
Thank you. And my question is to Anna. So you said that what is the adaptable holistic approach we can resolve that ethical issue? Can you explain holistical approach? Hello?
Fantastic short question, and I'm just going to go, I'm favouring the back of the room, I'm afraid, at this session.
A short one too, Delphine from Target Malaria. Also, it was about to Anna. And my question was about, because instead of having the Research Ethics Committee trying to cover a lot of topics that they might not be well equipped with, how do we map and that's your favorite topic, right? How do we map the existing governance frameworks and see actually where are gaps, or whether someone else is already dealing with this, and how do we make it practical to researchers to then address it to different bodies?
Brilliant. Okay. Hold those thoughts, panelists. They can catch you in the coffee break, which is after the breakout groups, which we are going now. Do not get sidetracked to get coffee now. Go straight to your breakout group and hold those questions.